Okay, so today I want to kind of take a few minutes and look at through some of the basic concepts of AWS. As we're preparing for any exam, you know, we have to understand how a lot of these hands-on components that we're creating are fitting together. It makes sense that, we take some time away from the hands-on and make sure that, we have the basic concepts down because we're starting to kind of get into very in-depth hands-on. So what I want to kind of do is I want to ensure that we study and spend a few minutes on those hands-on components that we're putting together, but also we start to look at what is available to us for those learnings. So let's kind of start by opening up our GitHub series. So as you know, all of our notes basically here are coming into this hands-on folder. I have one folder here called configuration setup. So this is all about kind of setting up your environment as you basically need. And then here's your hands-on notes that we're going to look at. And if you start to kind of look at these, you sort of see we haven't got really kind of complicated yet, but now is a kind of good time to make sure that we've got a feel for what AWS is, and we're starting to kind of get into some of the kind of more complicated hands-ons. Especially when we get around compute and Kubernetes and kind of areas kind of like that. It just kind of makes sense that we spend some time before we kind of go ahead. So what I've done here is I've started as always a new notes here. And I'm going to name this 410 hands-on AWS introduction overview. And again, um, I update these as I'm kind of going along. So I'm studying with you guys. I've always sort of said that we're always learning together. So I'm basically kind of updating these as I kind of go to what basically makes sense. So what we'll kind of call this is AWS introduction services overview. Um, But if you look at the kind of top note here, it basically sort of says the AWS Amazon Web Services offers a broad set of cloud-based products, including compute, storage, database, analytics, networking, mobile developer tools, management tools, Internet of Things, security, enterprise applications on demand available in seconds with pay-as-you-go pricing. There's a huge amount of components there. Huge amount of components that it actually offers. But some of the actual fundamental areas are all the same. So, what I've kind of done here is I've kind of gone over and I've gone to the internet and I've kind of started looking around for, things like the basics of AWS PVC, the private virtual cloud, understanding basic networking of the virtual private cloud. This is a great um, page here from Medium from Amit Singh Rahor, and I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that correctly. But um, Amit has done a great job to kind of summarize what the kind of components are for PVC and how the actual networking all kind of works together. So, if you look at the way he kind of describes like a VPC, so a virtual private cloud is a service from AWS which enables us to launch AWS resources in a logically isolated virtual network, similar to a local data center. It gives us complete control of our virtual networking environment, including resource placement, which AZ, connectivity, and security. So a few of these kind of items we start to kind of look at, and we will really kind of get more kind of in depth into these. But you know, he goes on here to actually describe a number of items here. And then he goes on to describe like what a CIDR is. To create a VPC, we need to supply a classless into domain routing. This is, it's one of the probably the most complicated um, concepts, but there's plenty of support for finding out about a CIDR and what CIDR block. But basically, just kind of think of a CIDR block as a piece of the network. So your network is a large network, and what you're trying to do is just kind of carve off a number of addresses. So imagine that, you have a city and you want to call one road A. You need to have, house numbers for each of those houses, because somebody needs to get the post, right? So that's all you're basically doing. You're just kind of carving off like a piece of an area of the network, and you're doing exactly the same. You're just basically assigning an address. So this is one of the most probably complicated. If you're not too familiar with it right now, I would kind of leave it for the moment. The next thing we need once we have a VPC is the ability to access resources from local over the network. An internet gateway is a component. So basically, your gateway is just as the name says, it's a gateway into the internet. So um, there's not a huge amount, if you're obviously getting into real, away from study wise, but you're getting into real kind of work, this becomes a really critically important topic of how um, your resources will basically access the internet and security for your resources. But um, right now, for a kind of exam, a subnet is a range of IP addresses. You can have basically a public subnet and a private subnet. Um, quite quite kind of straightforward. Just making sure that there's route tables that are always associated with network. So that's something that will always kind of come up about route tables. Will always kind of come up about networking. And this again here, as we sort of say, here's your route table that can be associated to a public or private subnet. But basically, you sort of see every resource created in a subnet gets a private IP address from the CIDR. This becomes really kind of critically important when you're trying to carve out your network, but also you're trying to ensure that the components can also kind of access each other. They're in the correct subnet. Um, they can all communicate with each other. Um, Elastic Network Interface, it represents a virtual network card. So basically, your computer at home has a network interface, but in the cloud world, it can be a virtual network card. Um, and security groups are tied to these interfaces, so that's kind of important as well. That basically, a network card basically has a security group, and sometimes it just has like a kind of default security group. But you need to kind of make sure that you really kind of understand how kind of security groups actually work. And this is a great um, this is a great kind of overview picture here that you have your VPC availability zone. So this is your VPC. This is your piece of your network. This is your availability zone. So basically, if with this one down, you'd probably have another one. Availability zone 1, availability zone 2. And basically, kind of coming in here into your resources onto your virtual network card. So this is your virtual network card to bring back the information. So it's allowing that kind of access between your public subnet and your private subnet. Elastic IP, I mean, probably what an IP address is, where you actually have, even your computer at home will have an IP address, but you can actually have Elastic IP, basically. So it's just a kind of fixed IP. Security group, security group acts as a firewall to control inbound and outbound traffic on the NIC. Basically, this is probably one of the biggest areas that if your um, if your component isn't working at the very very start when you initialize this, so if it basically can't, if one component can't speak to the other, generally it kind of means that there's generally something wrong with your firewall rules. So that's kind of critically important that you kind of understand. You've got your inbound rules, which basically means that you're coming in. You got your outbound rules, so basically the component is going out and what it can kind of talk to going out. But the inbound rules is basically saying what am I allowing into my component here, you know, and that's all kind of handled by kind of security groups here. So it says a security group acts as a firewall to control inbound and outbound traffic. You know, um, it says here, um, which is by default, which is kind of critically important. A security group by default, it allows all outbound traffic. So anything coming from the component going out is allowed. It denies all coming in. So that's kind of critically important to actually kind of make sure that you kind of understand that, even for, you can sort of see here, for example, if you want the SSH into your computer, so a Linux box will basically allow kind of SSH protocol into your computer. You have to make sure that you've actually allowed that port 22 because the protocol port for SSH is port 22. So you have to actually allow that as well. Make sure you definitely allow that. Here's network access control lists. They act as a firewall at the subnet level. Again, this is where if something wasn't communicating, and you basically had like an access control list, you'd have to make sure that you basically have allowed all of the access through. In that gateway, we probably won't see kind of too often. BBC endpoint. So it says here to access AWS services that are not at VPC. So some of the services are not in VPC. We need to traverse the internet. They have to go over the internet. So this basically just means that they actually have to kind of go out and go over the internet to get to S3 or DynamoDB or any of these kind of services. And it says VPC endpoints are virtual devices. So basically, what you're trying to do is you're just allowing basic access um, into your components that may not just not be kind of right beside each other. So because when they basically have to go back out onto the internet, so that's always kind of a kind of tricky one to kind of understand because so this says the AWS services are not um, to access AWS services that are not in VPC. So the services that are not built into the VPC, have to traverse the internet. So to reduce the traffic insecurity, AWS provides a service called VPC endpoint. VPC endpoints are virtual devices. What it does is creates a prefix root in the private subnet's root table. So it just allows access into the component basically. The endpoint gets a private IP from the selected subnet. So the endpoint gets a private IP from the selected subnet. So kind of you can sort of see here gets this is your VPC endpoint. It gets a private IP from the selected subnet, and since the IPs are private, we don't need to use NAT or Internet Gateway. This way, the traffic never leaves the AWS network. So this is a kind of complicated topic, and I think we'll kind of do something, on this in much more kind of depth at a later stage. But just for right now, um, you have what's called kind of private links here, and this is again kind of networking. This is where we're going to get into, but it's going to be a little bit kind of complicated for now. The HCP, you know, um, your basic passing configuration information hosts on the TCP network. So we can create our own DHCP options for the virtual private cloud, DNS name, DNS servers, NTP for time. These are time servers. These are naming servers. So that basically um, to give it your system host name. Because people, humans won't really remember what an actual IP is, but they may remember what the host name is. Transit gateway. This is a complicated topic as well. This is something as right now you may not need to kind of understand, but proxy tunnel here, direct connect. This is where you're just establishing a direct connection over to your systems from your to your on-premise data center. The flow log, that's basically just where you're looking at logs. There's a kind of a few things here, that are a lot more kind of complicated. But if you're going to attempt the exam, you definitely need to kind of spend a bit of kind of time on this. Practice these, understand what they kind of are. If you haven't used them or haven't heard of them, try and find some examples online where you basically see if you can actually generate some type of sample of them, just to sort of see if you can actually get them working. because I think definitely it would 100% kind of help the way. But really, kind of the big ones kind of for today, it's kind of just going to go back. The big ones for today is definitely like the VPC itself, and understanding about availability zones of the VPC. Um, Understanding a little bit of kind of root table, because root table contains your IP information table, and your security groups. For your security groups, basically you're basically just getting all of the actual um, rules, like type of firewall rules into your component and out of your component. So whatever the component may be, you know, we've kind of covered a few of these kind of here, but as we get into the actual exam, and learn a lot more about these, you really have to kind of spend some time in these, kind of drill into these, make sure that you really kind of understand these ones, especially from the exam wise. And that's why I wanted to kind of pull this up, because it kind of starts off maybe a little bit, where people have kind of heard about it, but then it kind of goes into a lot more kind of, in depth. I mean, if you had to kind of design this, you just kind of have to understand, about kind of mesh peering and that kind of information. You can sort of see in a region you can have 3 VPCs here, and that's basically got a connection point here, and same another region, another region. This could be global, and then kind of coming back to your kind of direct connect over to your data center. So DC always means data center. But basically, there was that information, and then there was kind of this one here as well about fundamentals. Try and watch, as much of these as you basically kind of can. Like about kind of auto scaling and SageMaker, we kind of covered a little bit, but um, try and kind of watch a few things about this, about kind of more of the actual fundamentals of AWS, and what they actually kind of mean as well, because it will definitely kind of put you in a better place when you kind of come towards your exam. So um, this is just a kind of short video on that, and we're going to continue to kind of drill down and make sure that we kind of cover these, and cover them, you know, one by one, because really when you're studying for an exam like this, you have to kind of really go in depth. You know, my kind of theory here is that I spend most of my week kind of designing diagrams, and when it kind of comes to the studying part, I don't need to do the diagrams. I mean, if you kind of went to Google here and just says the VPC, um, let's sort of say AWS VPC here, and just kind of go into your kind of images here. I mean, you can see the amount of. If I was learning about VPCs here, you can actually sort of see, like here's a great one here about internet gateway that basically has your regions, your VPC, your subnet, your instances. Instances are always a computer type or of some sort, and your availability zones. Like here's another one kind of from Rackspace Technology. Where they're kind of showing you, that basically you'd have the cloud here going into your internet, going into your router, going into your EC2 instance. You have a private and a public IP, and this subnet also kind of has an IP here associated. So you're just kind of making sure that look through all of these, but don't spend time. My advice is unless you really kind of want to, don't spend time really trying to kind of design these yourself at the start, because you'll just kind of waste an awful lot of time. People have done kind of a great job and enough. You can sort of see here, it's all the same type of idea. Um, so people have spent enough time. You don't need to kind of spend even more time when you're basically trying to kind of study for exam. You're trying to get this information as quickly as possible and get it kind of into your mind as quickly as possible, so that you basically kind of understand. Well, if a question on internet gateway came up, what would it mean? Is there a router always behind your internet gateway? Is there availability zones behind your router? Is there VPC subnets? Is there instances behind all of that in some region, in some subnet? Um, just try and get those types of information together.